Dr. Mandryk is a professor of computer science at the University of Saskatchewan. Her research there looks at, among other things, how understanding player emotions can become a greater part of gaming experiences, increasing players' motivation and keeping them personally engaged in ways that can help them make better decisions, increase their health and well-being, and foster interpersonal relationships. In her award-winning PhD research, which was at Simon Fraser University, and that was supported by video game giant Electronic Arts, she actually pioneered the area of physiological evaluation for computer games. Since then, she's developed games to promote exercise, created systems that use games to increase focus and attention in children, and examined how playing games can benefit neurological development, among other things. So Dr. Mandryk is very research productive and has over 200 publications that have been cited thousands of times. And she's been the invited keynote speaker at several international game conferences. She also led the games research in the Canadian Grand Network when that still existed, and also leads the first ever Canadian graduate training program on games user research, which has $2.5 million of support from NSERC. She's also been the organizer of international conferences, including the inaugural Kai Play, the inaugural Kai Games Subcommittee, as well as the Kai 2018 conference, which is the biggest conference, as you all know, I'm sure. So this is all really cool stuff, but especially cool, I think, is the fact that at the Kai 2017 closing ceremony, Dr. Mandryk got the entire Kai audience to play the kazoo, so I thought that was pretty cool. Dr. Mandryk has also been honored with numerous awards, including being inducted into the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists in 2014, which was the inaugural cohort of the college. So if you're not familiar with it, the Royal Society is basically Canada's national academy. So this is very prestigious. She also received the University of Saskatchewan New Researcher Award in 2015 and the Canadian Association for Computer Science's Outstanding Young Canadian Computer Science Researcher Prize, that's a mouthful, in 2016. Her latest research is examining whether video games can be used to assess mental health. And it is this project in particular that earned her the prestigious Stacey Memorial Fellowship this year. So Stacey Fellowships are awarded to enhance the career development of, and I quote, highly promising university faculty who are earning a strong international reputation for original research. So earning such recognition very much highlights the international impact that Dr. Mandryk's research is making. And so we're very pleased to have her here at Tux today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Regan Mandryk.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I feel like I don't have to give a talk now because that was really long and you all know what I do. But still, here I am. I'm talking about something horribly titled Fun Science, and I'm excited to be here. So thanks to all of you who invited me into Tux for supporting this. It's a really exciting opportunity for me to be here. So as Ali mentioned, I'm at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm not sure how many of you have been to Saskatchewan, know what a Saskatchewan is, heard of it. Anyways, this is where it is, in case you wanted to know. This is my building, that's my office window pointing out there, but of course being Saskatoon, most of the time it looks just a little more like that. Very likely right now it looks like that, but our summers are lovely, so if you want to come visit, you just have to plan a little more strategically. But we're not really here to talk about all this. So I work at the U of S, but what is it that I work on? You got a nice overview in the introduction there, and I just wanted to very quickly give you a little overview of some of the things that I work on at the U of S. Games user research, games for health, and social games. So. As was mentioned, I started in games research actually during my PhD at SFU, which was funded in part by EA, in which, as was mentioned, I developed the methods for leveraging physiological sensing in games user research. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this type of work, I basically hooked people up to physiological sensors, similar to what you would see in a lie detector, and I built mathematical models of emotion while people were playing games. This may seem a little bit like old hat now, but back in 2001, there was nobody else doing this type of work. And this led to years of me trying to understand players and advancing the science of understanding players and their experiences, which is an area basically broadly called games user research. And in this topic that I work on, I work a lot with industry partners. So I've worked with Ubisoft, EA. This is actually a shot from a Toronto company, Alien Trap, and this is their game Apotheon. I worked with companies in Germany and most recently with Tencent Games in China, who's one of the biggest game producers, actually the biggest game producer in the world, because they own this company called Riot, which makes this game called League of Legends, and they also own Supercell, which makes this game called Clash of Clans. So I work with a lot of industry on trying to understand players and bring that into the software development process. And this work, as was mentioned, is funded by the NSERC Create program, Swagger, Saskatchewan Waterloo Games User Research, that I'm PI of. So the second area that I do a lot of work on is games for health. And these are games that we can use to promote behaviors, to promote exercise, healthy eating, other types of wellness, and also a lot of work on personalization models so that we can individually tailor games to individual players to improve their efficacy. And I spent years working on games to improve physical health, which formed really the first decade of my research as a professor. But then after my sabbatical in France, I sort of came to start working with people who were making a lot more impact by looking at how the built environment affects our physical health, or how national policy affects our physical health, which actually coincided with me returning to some of my earlier interests in emotions and stress and what that effect that has on our mental well-being. So my focus on games for health now is mainly on the assessment and treatment of mental health, focusing in particular on depression, anxiety, bipolar affective disorders, schizophrenia, and mood repair. So we're looking at using custom-built games for the assessment of different mental illnesses, big data mining of off-the-shelf game data for assessment of both mental illnesses and well-being, looking at augmented and mixed reality technologies for altering our perception of the world around us, and investigating also how people use commercial games naturally to mitigate noxious moods and to manage their stress and recover from stress. And as was mentioned, this work is funded mostly by my recent Stacy Fellowship, and it's what I'm really excited about right now because it's what I'm focused on most of the time, but I can't really get into it because the work's ongoing. So there's not a lot of content to talk about yet. So instead, what I'm going to be talking about is the third area of focus of what I do, which is my work on social games. And coincidentally, in terms of like the way this aligns with my funding, this is actually the topic of my NSERC Discovery grant that I received last year. So it's a current interest, but my interest in this area actually started very early on with the first project that I did when I started as a PhD student. So this is the very first thing I did as a PhD student. When I started, I created the first hybrid digital physical board game, which was submitted for publication literally in the 1990s, published in 2000. For those of you who know Melanie Torrey, there's a very young Melanie Torrey sitting in the front of that. I think she looks exactly the same now, but I had to build my own sensing hardware out of microcontrollers and sensors, and it was really exciting. But the issue was that when it came time to evaluate the player experience that was resulting from this, there were no appropriate methods. So my dissertation really took a turn, and instead I started creating new methods of understanding players and their experiences by modeling emotion. But my interest in social play experiences started way back there. It was actually present in my dissertation work, in which I modeled the way people interacted with games when they were playing versus a friend or a stranger or versus the computer, and has remained strong through the years. So overall, you might notice something about my work, that everything has to do with games. And if I were to summarize the overarching goal of what I do, I would say that I investigate how we can leverage the motivational pull of games to motivate behavior, assess health, and connect people. This is normally the point at which I would try and start convincing my audience that games are a cultural artifact worthy of study, which basically translates into, please publish my work, or that the economic opportunities that games offer means that they're worthy of academic innovation, which translates into, please fund my work. But instead, I think what I'm going to do is take the next 45 minutes to convey why games, why study games, and how do we do it. So I guess first of all, what I'd like to know is, how many of you consider yourselves a gamer? Anyone consider themselves a gamer? Oh, a few. Okay, and how many of you were gamers before you were professional grant writers and practitioners and mentors and students and whatnot? Okay, so some of you have a history here. So I want to talk about games. And I want to talk about, and it has to do, the reason why I study games might be a little scary to some of you. Some of you who didn't raise your hand, you might be a little scared by what I'm about to show you. So I'm going to ease you in with some of the stuff that's easy to access. So first of all, money. So games are an over $100 billion industry worldwide. Canada is the third largest producer after the US and Japan, or has been traditionally, but probably is being put into fourth place by China. And this is good news for a software industry that contributes to over $3 billion to the Canadian economy every year and employs tens of thousands of people. On the consumer side, it's also good news. So consumer spending on games has surpassed spending on both music and movies combined. And if you look at things like, the most recent release of Red Dead Redemption 2, which was I think 2 weekends ago, there was more money spent on that than on any other entertainment release in history. So more than on like the Harry Potter books, more than on the opening weekend of Avengers Infinity Wars. So like the opening weekend of a video game has now been like the most successful financial opening weekend. So probably most of you are still feeling pretty comfortable. You're like, yes, entertainment is business, and we accept that and move on. But it does get a little scarier. So this is actually a picture of my own children visiting their cousins in Vancouver, and this is them all playing games. So 97% of boys under 18 and 94% of girls under 18 report playing video games regularly. I don't know if that scares you, but the average young person racks up about 10,000 hours of gaming by the age of 21, and that's almost as much time as they would spend in middle school and high school combined if they had perfect attendance. It's also that same magical number of hours, I don't know if you know about this, that Anders Ericsson's studies show that virtuoso musicians spent practicing. This was popularized and maybe oversimplified a bit by Malcolm Gladwell in his book, that it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert or a master. So that kind of means that the average young person is a virtuoso in playing games. So I don't know if some of you are scared yet. These are the future leaders of our countries. Well, maybe not these particular children, but children like them are the future leaders of our countries. These people will one day make our laws. They'll invent new planes. They'll perform my hip surgeries when I get old. And I'm sure that a lot of you are thinking these stats are horrifying, that our future society is going to be run by people who grew up playing so many games. And you're thinking perhaps of some of the negative stereotypes of what happens to people who play games. You're thinking perhaps of someone like Jenkins. I don't know how many of you know Jenkins, but he's the griefer from the Make Love Not Warcraft episode of South Park. He does a really good job of embodying a number of common stereotypes I think that people have about computer gamers. A bit lazy, unfocused, socially inept, or at least socially isolated. He has a mouse and some energy drinks and maybe even an astronaut diaper to ensure that his online achievements are not compromised by basic biology. And he doesn't really need friends, or does he? Like, we have to pause for a second and ask the question, do we really need to have social interactions with each other? Or was that just for our hunter-gatherer ancestors who needed each other to survive mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and droughts and other ancient pestilences? So why do we need social connections? Well, there's a lot of work that shows the importance of social satisfaction. For well-being, for health, there's a lot of work around depression and addiction that talks about the importance of social connections. When people feel socially ostracized, there are measurable and harmful effects on how they interpret the world around them. So we've done work on how ambiguous information suddenly becomes interpreted as threatening in some way. It becomes interpreted as hostile. The world can become, in some ways, a darker, more threatening place. And recent studies even show that those who live alone or feel socially isolated have a 30% increased risk of mortality at a given age. So basically, isolation and rejection are quite harmful because they thwart one of our fundamental needs, which is our fundamental need to belong to a community. And games and play have been an important part of combating this over the years. So this picture is the well-known Renaissance painting Children's Games by Peter Bruegel. The painting was finished in 1560 and depicts a lot of Flemish children's activities. There's over 200 children engaging in I think 91 different playful activities. And at least 36 of these are considered games by our standard definition of what a game is. Things like touch tag, blind man's buff, and lawn bowls are still played by children today and have been passed along for 450 years. It's astonishing that these 36 games that were depicted so long ago have survived on playgrounds for almost half a century, handed down from generation to generation, or I guess half a millennium. But there is, however, something else about the games that stands out in this painting, and that's that all of them are multiplayer games. So games have long been used to support social interaction. I'm not a historian, but I do know that board games, dice games, tile games, and sports go way back. And more recently, family board game nights, tabletop gaming and board game stores, weekly poker games among friends, they can help us satisfy our need for relatedness, and they can create shared experiences that draw us closer to one another. People play on recreational sports teams, which might also be about keeping in shape, but people also do things like play pub trivia, play chess in the park, and play pool in the bar, and these playful social activities are moving into digital spaces at a rapid pace. Digital games, like the one here, are increasingly being employed to help form and maintain social relationships in homes, in gaming bars, and in other places. They have this additional advantage, though, in that they can help distributed friends and families maintain social connections. So siblings who've gone off to different colleges can still play Fortnite together online. Parents can play Words with friends with their kids who move out of home, or college friends who move to different cities afterwards can still continue to get together and play Destiny every Sunday. And researchers are also creating specialized systems for this. I mean, we know that people enhance their friendship by playing social network games. Work done actually at the DGP here in Toronto years ago showed that seniors play online poker together to stay connected. And kids with mobility disabilities can connect through online multiplayer games that have been developed at Queen's University. The Entertainment Software Association reports in 2016 that the majority of gamers play in multiplayer mode at least weekly because they feel that video games help them to connect with their friends. Multiplayer co-op modes are increasingly common, and people are playing games online for an average of 6 hours a week with both friends and strangers, and playing co-located together on average 5 hours a week in person. So there are a couple of questions that arise out of this context that I've just presented. Obviously, do games satisfy our need for social connections? Do digital games? Do digital games when they're played online, and how much? Is the efficacy of games compromised when we move them online and we replace face-to-face conversation with audio chat or text chat, or even using game moves themselves as kind of conversational items? And these are important questions, and part of what I've been working on with my students and colleagues over the past few years. So, without further ado, I'm going to get into it. First question, how can we enact existing relationships through games? I've done a lot of work in this area, but I'm just going to start with two examples using the very young and the very old. In this project, we created small games for pre-literate children, that's babies to 4 years old, that run in a transparent window on top of Skype. And this is because I don't know how many of you have ever interacted with a kid, but if you want to interact with a kid, you just don't sit down and have a conversation with them. You get down, you play Lego, you play with toys, you read with them, you interact with them on their level, you basically play. And through this game, we wanted to connect families with young children who live apart and make them feel closer and not more isolated with each other. This is quite an old project. It was in collaboration with Microsoft and also with Sesame Street at the time, because Sesame Street really felt that intergenerational play was a huge part of how children learn. So they were quite interested in it. We then extended this work to support intimacy between romantic couples who were distributed using different games, of course. This work was also in collaboration with Microsoft, but I don't know, Sesame Street was not really interested for some reason, so they didn't sponsor that one. On the other side of life's progress, we have work supporting caregiving dyads through play. So this is my student, Catherine Gerling, looked at how playing games can support older adults in institutionalized care during her PhD. And this particular project was really about caregiving dyads, so people whose relationships are burdened by the responsibility of caregiving. These are spouses taking care of each other, parents taking care of their kids, and most commonly, kids taking care of their parents. And so we created a number of different games that had symmetric and asymmetric roles. These were motion-based games that used the body as input. They accommodated things like mobility impairments by incorporating wheelchairs into the game, and also people who had other forms of mobility aids. And most importantly, for the purpose of this talk, though, the players, after playing these games together, felt closer, and what they described as being less burdened in the relationship. So a relationship that's characterized primarily by the burden of care was suddenly, for a moment anyways and briefly, able to be about something else, about cooperating towards a shared goal through this activity of play. And more recently, I've also been looking at how synchronization over a distance can be used to affect feelings of closeness and rapport with PhD student Raquel Robinson. So mirroring, or doing the same movements as somebody else at the same time, is an intervention that's used to support the development of intimacy among dyads. So in our case, the synchronization that we're using is the game mechanic. So players have to synchronize both to stay in the middle lane of this infinite runner that has a canoeing theme for some reason, because it's Canada, I guess. And so they want to stay in the middle lane. They also want to duck under obstacles and avoid whirlpools. Instead of motion, though, in this case, we use emotions as the input. So they're sensed through breathing in unison. So if players breathe in unison, then they stay in the middle lane. And we also use heart rate as another option. So if players maintain a synchronized heart rate, they stay in the middle lane, otherwise they start to veer. And then we have joint action and facial expressions, making a happy face or a look of disgust, for example, at the same time to trigger obstacle avoidance. This is a newer project because we're looking at how synchronized biometric input in a playful context can be used to generate feelings of closeness among people who live over a distance. So we can use games to help maintain relationships that already exist, but what about using them to form new ones? And why would we even want to do that? So I'm just going to show a series of examples from our work in this area around developing trust. So why am I interested in trust as an outcome measure? Well, I think all of us can probably think back and remember working in a group, and it was just great. Everyone was contributing, communication went smoothly, things got accomplished. Most of us also probably experienced the opposite, though. Situations in which team members start bickering, no one wants to take charge, and the thanks at the end of emails start sounding more passive-aggressive and less sincere. So the question is, where does good teamwork come from? Well, literature in organizational psychology suggests that it's actually a lot to do with trust. The idea that we are vulnerable and that we rely on others is important. So it's common for companies to try and help their employees develop trust through team building exercises. For me, this whole company goes on a retreat and practices trust falls and does ropes courses thing seems like something from a movie, like it literally happened in Pitch Perfect 2 for any fans out there of the Pitch Perfect series. But a couple years ago, I went to visit my colleagues at Microsoft Research, and while en route, Corey Inkpen texts me to see if I brought gym clothes, because one of the days they were doing a team building exercise and she was taking everyone to a ropes course. And that's one of the times when I really understood that my life as an academic was very different than how things work in industry, because I could not imagine taking my research group to a ropes course or knowing how to fund that even with my grant funding. But it is relatively common for companies with co-located employees to do these types of things for team building. But distributed work environments are becoming increasingly common. People don't always live where they work. And it's really tough to do a trust fall online. Or is it? We felt like games might have certain properties that made them a good candidate for helping distributed teams build trust. So in this project, my PhD student Ansgar Depping and I compared an online cooperative interdependent game that we created to an online social icebreaker task in terms of how well it helped two strangers develop trust. The game was based on the German board game Labyrinth, and it's a cooperative and interdependent game in which one player has to navigate a maze and collect gems, and the other player helps them by pushing the walls around the maze to create a path. It involves a lot of coordination and communication between the players. The social icebreaker task was a prompted series of questions about hobbies, vacation preferences, pizza toppings, other bits of personal information exchange. And the takeaway that I want to mention is that the game worked much better than a social task at facilitating trust development between two strangers online. Higher is better in this chart. And the reason that it did so is because the game was robust to factors that undermine trust development. Individual factors like a person's overall propensity to trust, which is what we have in this chart, but other factors like their agreeableness that comes from their personality, as according to the Big Five model, experiential factors like how much they enjoyed the experience. The success of social tasks was really dependent on these individual factors, but the game was resilient to these individual differences among people. In a follow-up study, we really wanted to unpack which of these game mechanics worked and why. So we created 4 versions of the Labyrinth game and established comparability between them, looking at competition versus cooperation and independence versus interdependence. And we showed how cooperation and interdependence affect different aspects of player experience, how players felt more related during play, and how much they enjoyed the experience. But most importantly, we confirmed that both factors individually affect the relationship of the players outside of the game, affecting the amount of trust that actually developed between them. And so we tend to think of cooperation as the go-to game mechanic to say if we want to develop a relationship between two people. But what we found is that in a competitive context, as long as the game was interdependent, it was just as effective at facilitating trust. And I get into it more in the paper, but it's more effective, partly because it inspires more conversation between the players. We've extended on this work recently by looking at how this is happening. So how is trust developing between dyads in the context of two strangers still playing this Labyrinth game? We gathered features from their conversation, their facial expressions, their eye blink rate, their game performance, their conversational patterns, the tone of their voice using speech signal analysis, and to see if we could determine how trust forms and also to create predictive models of interpersonal trust under development. So these examples show how we can use games to form trust in new relationships. But the question now is, does this work when people have different interests or abilities? What if someone doesn't like the game Labyrinth? What do we do then? How can we design multiplayer games effectively when people have differing abilities or interests? So we did a series of studies around this idea of balancing and matchmaking and the effect that it has on the interpersonal experience. We all know, or those of you who do play games or sports know that multiplayer games can be fun. However, multiplayer games are not always enjoyable when the skill levels of the players are vastly different. It isn't fun if one player is destroying everyone else. Losing players become frustrated if the game is too difficult, and the better player becomes disengaged if the game is too easy. There's no suspense when the outcome of a game is uncertain, which is no fun for everyone. I think at this point I was thinking about making a Maple Leafs joke, but then I realized they're actually doing pretty well this year, so I probably shouldn't make that Maple Leafs joke. Also, I come from a city that has no NHL team, so really I have no right. Anyways, it's very hard to balance a game when the challenge is determined by the skill of another player. So the difficulty of the game actually comes from the opponent, which is unpredictable, whose behaviors and skills can't be controlled by a system that is used to doing things like dynamic difficulty adjustment. So we were conducting multiple lines of research over the years to address this imbalance. We used games with like this racing game where we implemented simulated drivers so we could look at different algorithms for matchmaking and balancing. But I'm going to walk through a series of studies that we did using this, we call it a bespoke FPS, that was built on the Unreal Engine. So in this series of papers, we investigated how to use aim assistance to balance multiplayer experiences. So basically it's research on Fitz law, but with explosions and headshots, so like a sexy kind of Fitz. And our first paper, which we published at CHI 2014, investigated whether or not aiming assistance could improve performance at all in an FPS in the context of a single player experience. We showed that it did. Aim assistance works really well in a targeting range scenario, so like a shooting gallery type game. But it also works a little less effectively when realistic game elements are introduced into a walkthrough. So things like assault rifles, the presence of friendlies. When we start bringing those things in, it still works, but it gets a little tougher. Our next paper, published at CHI 2015, took these aiming assistance techniques and applied them in a multiplayer context, in which people competed against an opponent. And we actually showed in this case that aiming assistance worked really well. And when I say aiming assistance, I'm referring to things like bullet magnetism and something like an implementation of the area cursor, but in a game condition. It minimized the score differential, and it even worked for players who had vast skill differences, so these novice-expert pairings. Assistance improved the perception of fairness for the weaker player without detracting from the perceived fairness of the stronger player. Assistance improved the weaker player's perspective of their own competence in the game, but didn't affect the stronger player's feelings of their competence. And most importantly, although assistance helped that weaker player feel more competent and feel like the matches were more fair, it actually increased the experienced enjoyment for both players, regardless of who was being helped. So when matches were balanced, players had more fun. So despite the large degree of assistance that was sometimes provided, the perceptibility was actually quite low for players who were assisted. They never knew that we were helping them out. And stronger players only noticed the highest level of assistance for the technique that employed multiple approaches at once, where we actually used aim assistance plus wall hacks plus other approaches all at the same time. So then that kind of brought the question up for us, and for those of you who might game on a regular basis, what if they did notice? How would they feel? What would happen if you tell people that you were helping them? Because we know, do people feel like they are cheating or that they are being cheated? And there's lots of reasons to believe that that might detract from their experience. And cheating in sports and in games has a long history that we can draw from to help illustrate our points. So this is a photo of Femke van der Driessen. A few years ago, she was disqualified from the World Cyclocross Championship in Belgium for having a motor hidden in her bike that assisted her in the race. The International Cycling Union was, of course, outraged, calling this technological fraud. She was banned from the sport for 6 years, and she announced her retirement from cycling at the ripe old age of 19. Most of us probably hear this and think, well, that's fair. She deserved this because she cheated. But if you think about like a family bike tour, on the other hand, it's an entirely different matter. If a grandfather wants to use a motor in his bike so that he can keep up with his grandson, he probably won't be banned from family activities for 6 years. So a bike race can be held in kind of various settings. It can be competitive, it can also be social. And the setting determines whether or not we accept the idea of being assisted. And while a friendly bike race between a grandson and his grandfather is still mostly a social activity, it can be competitive in nature. And what we know from previous literature and from the series of studies that I just showed you is that competition is that it's most engaging when it's balanced. So back to our game. We recruited novice expert pairs and had them compete against each other. And this was at CHI 2016. And what we found, we asked the question, is disclosure harmful? I'm just going to pause this because it's just going to be headshots all the time. Was disclosure harmful? When we told them they were being assisted, was it harmful? What we found was basically no. Assistance increases enjoyment, it increases suspense. The weaker players felt more competent and less tense, and there were no negative effects of disclosure on either the weaker or the stronger player. Everyone enjoyed themselves more. So why? Why was disclosure not harmful? When people know we're assisting them, why don't they care? In the paper, we discussed how engagement that results from balanced play is actually more powerful than disclosure, and that the game setting changes all these expectations. So if you're playing to have fun with somebody, your goal is to have a balanced, fun game, not to prove that you're more elite than them in a certain environment. In a competition, in like a StarCraft tournament or something, you would expect something very different. Plus, there's this thing that some of you probably know about and are thinking about already called self-serving attribution bias. I don't know if you've heard of it, in which people attribute success to themselves and failure to external influences. So like a current example in my world right now is that like some of my Chi papers submissions were actually rated fairly highly, which is obviously because I'm a really good paper writer. And some of them were actually kind of rated quite lowly, but that's because the reviewers just didn't quite get it, right? So it's like the success, I take it and it's mine, and the failure, no, that's somebody else, that belongs to somebody else. And we do this in general in life, and we think that's the mechanism by which these balanced matches are actually resulting in more fun for everyone. So assistance still works even when you tell people that you're assisting them. Now, some of you may be skeptical on the value of assistance because maybe you're thinking that assisting people will impede their skill development over time. If we keep helping them, how are they going to get better? Well, we tested that too. In a complex multi-day study involving shooting galleries and many game walkthroughs, the takeaway message from this study is that assisting players did not impede their skill development. It helps them when they're being assisted, but when we take it away, they don't have compromised learning gains. They learned just as much and they developed their skills just as much as those who were not being assisted at all. And finally, it even works when balancing for extreme difficulties in skill or ability. So this project combined our work on balancing and our work on exergames, looking at how to effectively balance exergame play between people with vastly different abilities. So we were able to pair an able-bodied person with a person who uses a wheelchair and have them compete in a multiplayer clone of DDR that used different balancing algorithms to effectively hide assistance. Because stepping from one side to the next is a lot easier and a lot faster than making a movement in a wheelchair, which takes a lot more effort and more time. The wheelchair movements, by the way, are being sensed with a Microsoft Connect through a toolkit that we developed. So what we did, we were able to show that by effectively hiding the assistance that we were providing in different ways, it was more effective, and we were able to pair people with very different, vastly different skills and abilities. So now we know that games help maintain and build social connections, even when people have vastly different abilities. But how do they satisfy us, and why? So here are some recent things. Going back for a second to the work on interdependence and cooperation. So we started asking some questions that resulted from our work on interdependence and cooperation. We started asking things like, how real are our in-game friends, the ones that we just know online that we've never met in person, but we actually play with them every Sunday? How do in-game friendships develop, and how do they satisfy our social well-being? Using structural equation modeling, we modeled the relationships between aspects of the gaming community. In this case, we looked at how interdependent your gaming community was, how cooperative was the game that you were playing, and we also included this other thing about toxicity. So how toxic is the game community that you're a part of? And we looked at how that affected in-game social capital. And we looked at both social capital in terms of bonding, which are those kind of like few deep ties that you have, and also in terms of bridging, which are these kind of more extensive, but maybe, shallow has a negative connotation, but these kind of shallower networks of friends that provide you like a broader reach into society. And then we looked at how social capital that's experienced in the game. So this is how much social capital you have in the game. So in your game community, your Fortnite community, your Destiny community, how much social capital do you have in there? And then we looked at how this actually translates into out-of-game well-being, which we operationalized in terms of loneliness and also satisfaction of relatedness. So first, our findings highlighted two strong predictors of in-game capital: interdependence and toxicity. Cooperation was actually less crucial for developing social capital than common wisdom suggests. A lot of the previous work assumed that working towards a shared goal is the important part, that competition couldn't possibly yield feelings of social closeness. But in this model, cooperation was not significant. So it was interdependence and a lack of toxicity that were the predictors of both bonding and bridging. And then second, we determined that we showed that in-game capital is actually associated with reduced feelings of loneliness and increased satisfaction of relatedness. So our finding suggests that social capital that's developed within a game is strongly and positively related to players' psychological well-being outside of the game. And this informs both the design of social games and our theoretical understanding of in-game relationships. This was a survey-based study in which people were primed to reflect on their own gaming experiences and then answer a bunch of subjective questions. But we're also looking at specific games and behaviors within those specific games. So we've been extending our results to collaborative play mechanics in natural gameplay through statistical modeling of both survey responses and behavioral data as accessed through, in this case, the League of Legends API and the World of Warcraft API. So in this case, what we do is we gather data from players, but then we also scrape all of their play data to see if we can model how people who are, for example, differentially lonely, so are people who are more lonely playing with different patterns than people who are less lonely. We already have interesting results on how people choose roles and play styles to satisfy their need for different types of hierarchical relationships. So we've been looking not just at the feeling of affiliating with others, which is how people tend to think about social relationships, this idea of fellowship and affiliation, but we've also been looking at the importance of hierarchical relationships. So how do I experience being in charge? How do I experience being dominant, which is pretty important for some types of games? Or how do I exhibit leadership within a game? Or how do I actually support others? Support is a big part of a lot of games. There are actually roles specifically called support roles for this reason that people might choose to play. And now we're looking into, like I said, how players are differentially satisfied with their relationships in life, how they exhibit different play patterns and styles. We're also linking this with the concept of passion for activity, and this is stuff that's ongoing as well. So passion, when you experience passion for something that you do, it can be divided into harmonious passion and obsessive passion. I'm not sure how much you guys know about passion, but harmonious passion is a very ordered pattern of passion. It's like you get a lot out of the activity that you're passionate for. It provides you a lot of positive influences in your life. Obsessive passion, on the other hand, is kind of when we think about people who play games too much, we're thinking about that obsessive passion maybe, the idea that it's a disordered pattern of play. People play a lot, but they don't get a lot out of it. They feel compelled to play, like controlled to engage in the activity rather than feeling like they're doing it voluntarily. And so these are both, like you can have both types of passion for an activity. But the interesting thing is that most work that's been done in other domains of sports, music, other things, show that like obsessive passion can be quite harmful for well-being, but harmonious passion, regardless of how much you play, is not. So if you play a lot of games, or if you do a lot of swimming, or if you play a lot of chess or whatever, it's not necessarily harmful for you to do all that if it's harmonious, so if it's not affecting your life in negative ways. So people have demonstrated that passion orientation is rather important for predicting whether and how digital social play satisfies this need to belong that I talked about at the beginning. And we've been looking for behavioral indicators of this in-game data itself. So looking at, again, how the patterns of play might be able to predict this type of passion. And rather than just looking at behavior in a single game, we're also looking at behavior across many games and genres as accessed through Steam, which is the largest portal for digital play on personal computers. So we're using Steam data to identify patterns of interaction related to all sorts of collaborative play from natural gameplay across different games, and also for predictive modeling of social interactions. So for example, do lonely people exhibit different play patterns in their Steam data than those who are less lonely? So we have this data set that was collected over 9 months. Every 2 weeks, we scraped the data, and we labeled it at the beginning with validated scales related to social satisfaction and well-being, and also at the end of the 9 months. And because this was collected before the whole Cambridge Analytica drama, before the whole terms of license, whatever, changed in Europe, and all the changes that followed, this data set is actually just not possible to gather now. So we have this amazing data set that we haven't really done much with. So if any people out there who are into big data or machine learning or in general want to collaborate on something involving this type of very rich but also sparse in some ways longitudinal data, please let me know. So to go back to the beginning a bit. Our work has shown that games can help us maintain existing relationships and help us build new ones. Games can be used in this way even when our interests or abilities are vastly different from each other. And our current work also starts to look at how games satisfy our need for social connections in this molecular world. There was a generation of golf or bowling buddies who played together, and we're part of a new generation, maybe of clan members, guilds, raiding parties. People played chess in the park. Now they play Destiny in a mythic science fiction world. League in something called Runeterra. I had no idea that was the name of the world. And they also play together in World of Warcraft. And there are plenty of great social lessons that we can learn from playing online together, like how to survive a moose attack. So I don't know if you guys know this story, but in 2007, a 12-year-old Norwegian boy was attacked by a moose. And in the article, he described how he first yelled at the moose, distracting it so that his little sister could get away. And he said, "I believe this is called taunting, a move one uses in World of Warcraft to get monsters off the less well-armored team members." And then when he got attacked and the animal stood over him, he feigned death. And he said to the papers, "Just like you learn at level 30 in World of Warcraft." So don't let anyone tell you that playing WoW is a waste of time. It could save your life one day if you're attacked by a moose in Norway. Okay, so I just want to take these last few minutes that I have left to go over a few important points and the things that I tend to think about kind of on the meta level about all this. A I was debating what to talk about today, and I sometimes give entire talks on research methods and how they apply in a context in which we're researching games, which really is like something that's like my jam. It's something that I get really excited about, but most people don't get super excited about research methods. But it is something that I focus a lot on, and so I just wanted to highlight 4 of the common approaches that we use in the context of games research. So some of you are probably really familiar with a lot of these. So the first is ethnomethodologies. So if we want to actually ask a question like how much value do people place in their World of Warcraft characters, like we did in this paper, we need to ground it in their actual playing experience. So we actually do a lot of qualitative research where we're doing extensive interviews and observation. I haven't done any work myself where I've embedded myself in the game world. I don't know that I would be capable anymore, honestly, but the idea that we're actually getting rich qualitative data to answer questions that are grounded in people's actual experience is something that we do a lot of. The bulk of the work that I've done, I think, is very similar to what we see a lot in HCI, which is these lab experiments. Tightly controlled experiments where you bring people into the lab, you have them participate in an experiment in which there are multiple conditions, you randomly assign them to conditions, you gather all your data. This is probably the most common approach that I've used over the last 12 or 15 years or whatever, as I've been working extensively in games. But it's sometimes hard to find participants. The logistics are challenging. Sometimes you want to get a certain type of person into your lab, or sometimes the scheduling is very hard, or you want to connect strangers, or you don't want to just work with first-year university students of a certain socioeconomic class and intelligence. So you want to actually get a broader population. And something that we've done a lot over the last 10 years are really transition into online experiments. And so a lot of my work has been conducted online, either through portals like Mechanical Turk or by recruiting people from gamer forums, for example, or by specific forums for specific games. This is an example of a paper in which we wanted to look at the effects of social exclusion on people, like social exclusion through games on people. So we developed a game actually. We developed it's a nasty game. It's based on something called Cyberball. And so the idea is that you make a profile, kind of like if you're on an online dating site, you make a profile, you put yourself out there into the world, and then you have to solve math problems in front of other people, and then you're on a team that has to compete. But then what happens, because it's all like bots, not actual other people, you think it's other people, but they stop asking you to help at one point. They don't even want your help anymore on the team, and it makes you feel excluded. Or in the other condition, they keep asking for your help. And it's really people feel very excluded as a result of this because they've put themselves out there through their profile and they've done math in front of others, and now they're not being asked to contribute. But what we did find is that we were able to really reproduce this idea of social exclusion. And it's a standard paradigm that's actually used a lot in psychological experiments. So we do a lot of experiments online where we connect people with strangers, or we actually just gather data in the online context, and that's been really helpful, I think, for us to expand our demographics, to look for particular types of people, like people who play a lot of League of Legends, and we're able to actually gather the right people for our experiments. And then the last approach that I do a lot is kind of more of this data mining and analytics. It's very similar to ethnomethodologies in that we want to ground our results in people's actual behavior. And so we do that. This example actually comes from a collaboration that we did with a company in Vancouver who created a game called Pot Farm. It's Eastside, which is a farming simulation that has a marijuana theme. It's a Vancouver company, so it made sense at the time. I guess it's legal everywhere now. But what we did with this work is that we actually had we had all of their data from the kinds of things they were doing in the game, but by working with the company, we were able to reach out to the players and get them to answer a lot of subjective scales as well. So we were able to show that the personality that they had, I think it was Big Five actually, so how extroverted they were, how agreeable they were, predicted the kinds of things that they tended to do in games. So that their behaviors in games are actually well predicted by these. And also that their personality moderated what they did in games and how much they were satisfied with the game as a result. This is actually rather interesting. And the last thing that I wanted to approach for a second is, when you're doing data mining and analytics on gameplay, what kind of data is available to you? So I think that people who play games have an idea of what kind of data might be available, but it's actually a lot richer than we think. So this is something that I was showing recently when I wanted to talk to people about all the kinds of data that games provide. Because I think if you thought about it for a second, you'd be like, yeah, performance. Yeah, you can find out score. Maybe there's a couple other things, but games provide a lot of rich data that we can use to actually model preferences and behaviors. So of course there's usage data. So this is things like, what they would call the dosage, the frequency of play, the patterns that people are playing. Are they playing daily for a little bit, or are they playing like really long time? Are they snacking, or are they feasting kind of on their gameplay? And maybe even something as like entropy. What is the variability of those patterns of play? So there's a lot that you can get out of usage. There's a lot that you can get out of content and preference choices. So we can look at what kind of genres they're choosing, what kind of roles they're choosing. Are they choosing to be a healer or a tank? Are they a damage dealer? What are they doing? And of course the progress that they make through the game and what kind of stamina they have. And then we can get into things like behavioral choices, and this is what I'm doing a lot with actually the mental health work, is we're embedding decisions within a game. So we make a game in which we give people different power-ups, and we look at which ones they use and when. We give people cheat codes and see how they use them. We look at what paths they take through the game. We put choices into a game which we know people will react to differentially depending on who they are, and then we measure that reaction, and we measure the choice that they make. I mentioned fits earlier, and every talk has to have a velocity profile in it, I think. It's a requirement of where I came from, how I got to this point in life. So you can actually look at motor performance as well, so things like the kinematics of movement. I've been doing work with, the dynamics of typing, keystroke dynamics, movement patterns through the world, so you can use approaches from spatial GPS data, the same types of approaches that you would use looking at how people move through the real world. You can look at how they move through Minecraft or Skyrim or other 3D environments. And of course, we've also done work with pressure. So on modern devices, we can look at the pressure profiles, and we can determine, for example, we determined the difference between in-game frustration, which is a motivating kind of frustration, and this kind of out-of-game disheartening frustration, where you're just really frustrated with the game and not really enjoying your experience at all. And the pressure profiles were actually able to differentiate those two types of frustration in a game that was played on an iPad. So there's lots that we can get through motor. Cognitive, of course, is a huge area where we can get data from games. So decision making, reaction times, pattern recognition of players, executive function, the kind of errors they're making. These are like lots of cognitive performance metrics can be embedded within a game or gathered from off-the-shelf games. I talked a lot about social data, so we can look at who people are playing with. Like if you're playing League of Legends, are you playing with 5 strangers, 5 random people each time, or do you have it like a team of 3 that's consistently playing together? Or are you playing with the same 5 people all the time? Like it's this kind of like who you're playing with, what role you're taking, what variability there is in that, what kind of communication channel are you using, and what is the content of that communication provides a lot of rich stuff for us to use for modeling. And then of course, my background is in actually emotion recognition and affect, and so I think there's a lot that games provide there too. So we have both the audio signal when people are using in-game chat, so we can actually get affect or emotion from analyzing that audio signal. We can also get the sentiment from content analysis of speech. Physiological data that is not just limited to what we can sense by attaching sensors to people, but now we've moved non-contact, so we're sensing things online, so we can sense facial expressions through a webcam, we can sense heart rate through a webcam, not super reliably for heart rate variability for those of you that are interested, but you can get kind of tonic heart rate through a webcam. We've also been sensing eye blink rate and even pupillometry through the webcam as well. So there are a lot of things that you can get, and if you embed sensors into the game controllers or into the mice that people are using, you can get a lot of physiological sensors as well, which tell you a lot about how someone's feeling. And then lastly, behavior. So these are things like, I put expressions in here, but the posture that you have when you're sitting, are you leaning in, which you can gather from a webcam as well, by the way. Like how much are you leaning into the screen, how much are you leaning back? Your gaze patterns as they are exhibited over the screen. This kind of behavior actually gives you a lot of information about someone's affect too. So these data sources here are available in research lab games that we might create ourselves, but a lot of them can also be accessed through off-the-shelf games. So we can choose our research method, and we can choose our research method. We can decide whether we're randomly assigning people to condition in the lab or whether we're investigating natural behavior in the wild, and then we can start to gather this type of data. So I started this talk by asking a question. Why study games? I said I was going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about why study games. I talked about their economic impact and their social impact. I talked about their popularity. I talked about how we use them to answer questions around social play. But as a scientist, I don't do a lot of innovation. I do more discovery. It's, I think, opposite from a lot of what the people in this community are doing. But as a scientist, this is why I study games. This is why I choose to use them as a low-risk, high-reward, engaging experimental stimulus. It's a very rich source of data on human behavior and performance that we can use to ask and answer fundamental research questions about who we are and how technology affects our interactions with each other. And the questions that I choose to ask, as I said earlier, revolve around how we can motivate behavior, assess health, and connect people. So now that I've come to the beginning, what I really want you to take away from this in the end is that we should not be afraid of games as researchers, and we should not dismiss them simply as toys. Games are not the socially isolating experiences that some people have claimed them to be. They can be used to build new relationships, they can be used to maintain existing ones, and they also offer new opportunities for helping people satisfy their need for social connectedness, for social interaction, and for feeling a need to belong to a community. If you want to know more about this, this is a video, yeah. If you want to know more about this work, you can go to the HCI Lab website and filter for me, and realize that I didn't update this since earlier this year. And you can scroll through and you can see the publications. All of them are on there. If they're not open access, you can find them on there. And none of this work would have been possible without the team of graduate students and undergrads that I work with. This is Carl Gutwin in my group this summer at the University of Saskatchewan. And when I say we throughout this talk, it's really mostly them, and I'm writing a grant or maybe reporting on a grant, and these students are doing a bulk of the research. So without them, none of this would have been possible. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Yes, there is. Okay. So we've got some time for questions. Yeah, we've got some time for questions. Are there any questions?
Hi, I'm Zhizhong from DGP Lab, and great talk, thank you very much. As a researcher doing live streaming research, I'm interested in your comments on since right now there seems to be a shift of more and more people tend to watch people play. So does it have any implications for the design of games and also your research agenda for that?
Thanks for that. That's a really good question. And yeah, things are very different now. Both because not playing games is not just the only way that we engage with game content. I know a lot of people who don't play games actively, but engage with a lot of game watching. Kids watch a lot of games on YouTube and not just playing all the time. And it's become esports in general as well as is gaining popularity, even amongst at the collegiate level, with people being recruited through scholarships to play on League of Legends teams or StarCraft teams at universities. And so, as you know, this is becoming a different area. I think that from my perspective, I do look at streaming as a way of connecting players to the gamer. So as a way of feeling connected to others and building community, that's how I look at streaming. So the student that I mentioned at the beginning, Raquel Robinson, she's working on streaming and how we integrate actually biometric input or biometric output, I guess, in this case, into the streams. So if we display the physiological information of the person who's playing the game, what kind of value does that provide to the audience? And it's really an important question because when you watch an elite athlete, you can kind of see that naturally. You can kind of see what elite physical skills they have to perform that weird thing that they're performing. But with esports, it's hard to see that. If you don't understand the game, how do you know that that move they just made was crazy? You don't know that if you don't know the game, and you also can't physically observe the cognitive challenge that they're exhibiting and the elitism, I guess, of their cognitive. So if you can actually visualize that somehow, then maybe we can engage more people, and that's what she's working on. In terms of how it changes the design of games, it's not something that I have looked at, but I would encourage you to talk to Pejman over here afterwards, as he has a student. Samantha and him have looked a lot at how to design games specifically for enhancing the spectator experience, and that's something that they've been working on at UOIT, so I'd encourage you to talk to him.
Thank you very much.
There's one at the front and two at the back here.
That first question also I had. I had one sort of colloquial experience with that, where a friend's 7-year-old, I was concerned that because the game, they were experiencing a lot of frustration with the game they were playing, and I thought just watching it was a way to sort of just relax. But My other question was, now, to reference the South Park, if I'm right, was that player that you showed, he was ruining the experience for the other kids,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So he was sort of an online bully.
He's a griefer, yeah.
Yeah, or,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I'm wondering, like, you know, did you do any, you had that one slide that referenced out-of-game social groups.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering about, like, the kind of outliers, like bullies and rivals online, like how that might affect the cooperation,
Mhm.
or if a rival knew you were quote-unquote cheating, or, you know, or to prevent the South Park situation that we're like to sort of have an advantage over this possible. Anyways, yeah.
It's a really good question. That's why we brought in toxicity when we did that structural equation model, because we felt like it was really valuable to start considering the idea that people are actually intentionally destroying the play experience of another. It's not something that like is part of, I mean, I trash talk for sure, like, but I wouldn't, you know, that's very different than griefing. And I think that what my perspective is that it's extremely subjective. Toxicity and the experience of it is extremely subjective, and that's an actually important thing. So the companies that are trying to address toxicity, which they're trying to do, like, they have a lot of research trying to address this problem, because a toxic game community is an unsuccessful game community financially. So they're trying to address this problem by putting in barriers, by identifying toxic communication and then limiting people from being able to communicate in that way. But the problem with this kind of objective view of toxic communication is what might be experienced as very toxic to one player might be experienced as part of the interaction for another. So I actually, when I play, when I play board games with my family, my dad, my brother, and I are all super competitive, and we will lay each other out. We'll trash talk. We will do moves that would be perceived on the borderline of cheating, you know, and we all appreciate it in each other. But my mom and my sister don't. They see that as playing, they call it playing mean, literally. Okay, can we play, but we're not going to play mean. Because they experience this as very differently. I experience it as part of the game. They experience it quite differently, and that happens online as well. So something that someone says to one person might be perceived quite toxic, to another person sees it as part of the game. And I'm not talking about the stuff that's like objectively harmful. I'm just talking about kind of the lighter form, I suppose, that's not kind of objectively harmful. And so it's something that's addressing toxicity is really important. It's really important for game communities. In terms of our models, it's also really important to consider as well, because it really, like, you know, whether your passion is harmonious or obsessive, whether your game communication is toxic or supportive, has a huge influence on your well-being that results from it. So it's a very important, I think it's a very important feature, and companies are actively trying to figure out ways. I mean, there's been, ever since the first online games, ever since Ultima Online, I think, was the first to introduce a karma system, or EverQuest, one of those, like, introduced karma systems back in the day to try and get people to stop doing things like, you know, spawn camping, or being a player killer, or whatever, or like creating a little universe for the player killers all to play together over there, and it was not possible in other parts of the server, right? So, like, there's all sorts of ways that people have tried to address this type of griefing. Some more successful than others, I think.
Is the data of the anonymous stranger does correlate, like someone
Yeah.
does correlate to the known user.
So if
I got one slide that suggested it was existing groups of players or existing.
well, it was their existing game community. So there are people in that game community that they're anonymous to them. The one study, I actually never brought it up, was a study that we did of online game lounges, where we specifically looked at anonymous and impersonal interaction in game lounges, and found, and as just like with every other piece of online kind of research, anonymity has its problems. It allows people to be, you know, worse humans than they would be if there was an actual name attached to that profile. So anonymous interaction in games it follows the same pattern as in other communities as well. It provides shelter for people who are being toxic. We haven't looked specifically at the difference between, you know, those anonymous people in your game community and the friends that you play with regularly. No, that's not something that we've studied extensively. There was a question at the front here too, and one at the back here.
Hi, my name is Dennis. I'm an Inspired Game Developer, and thank you for joining us and giving us this lecture. So I had a question concerning a social economic aspect of the interaction between the gamer and the games themselves, and it's been a really heated debate topic as of late, and it's that of loot boxes and microtransactions. And sorry to be the advocate of the devil here, but it's something that's affecting a lot of us gamers as far as I'm concerned. And,
That they're taking them away, or
taking them away, not sure, but I mean, there's been a lot of debate about, and,
yeah.
we can't go anywhere without having it being mentioned at some
Yeah.
point or not. So so early in your presentation, you talked about how the idea of encouraging healthy behavior and practices, and a little later in your presentation, you also mentioned a part about gaming being a positive experience so long as it doesn't affect the real life aspect of the player's lives. So the thing is, the way some games are developed and the way some publishers are actually engaging in that is that they kind of go on as far as I'm concerned, a predatory way of encouraging, especially coming to loot boxes, games have pretty much become glorified casinos as of late. And what's your position on all of this?
Oh, that's a big question. First of all, I'd like to rebut the point that games are somehow separated from real life. So you said that it has an effect on their real life, and it's like we could talk about their out of game life, or a term that some people use, our game world and molecular world, because for a lot of people, gaming is their life. That is their real life. These are their real friends. These are their real activities. These are their real hobbies. And so using real, I think, as an alternative to game has a bit of a negative connotation. And I see you nodding, so you're with me here. In terms of loot boxes, I don't study addiction, and I don't study gambling. It's something that I've made a conscious decision not to move into. There are a lot of people looking at this. My position, my answer about this is from reading and not really from doing it myself. I have looked a little bit at reward responsivity. So how responsive are we as individuals to rewards, and how that affects how we respond to rewards in games. And this does kind of bridge into kind of the gambling aspect of loot boxes. I don't think that games are glorified loot boxes. I think that there's a lot of games with a lot of really deep and interesting mechanics. I think that it's a lazy thing for companies to do, to overuse them, to try and, maybe it's not lazy, but to try and keep players coming back to their game and to keep engagement going. There are other ways that we can foster engagement and facilitate engagement as game designers. There are lots of ways. We can do it through narrative, we can do it through mechanics, we can do it through approaches that try and, through novelty, through missions, through rewards, through completion tasks, through side quests, through social interaction. There are tons of mechanics that we can use to make people play our games and to enjoy them, and loot boxes are one little thing we can do, right? But I agree that they're extremely problematic, and they are very divisive in terms of how people are responding, and entire countries declaring them illegal in games is something that means that they should be probably discussed at a very deep level, and not just at a kind of a reactionary surface level. I don't know if I've really given you very much to go from other, but
It was pretty good, and as to answer you earlier, I'm a gamer myself, and pretty much it's the thing I do most of the day, if not studying and working. So even though I mentioned real life, I'm not really separating my life from my gaming life.
the emotions you feel are real.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Do we have time for one more?
It's 2:00.
There was
One, but I think we're out of time. Is there a burning question?
He had his hand up from the beginning, that's all.
No, but I have a very similar.
Okay, all right.
Okay, good, very good. Okay, well, in that case, it is just after 2, so we'll thank Regan again for her wonderful presentation.
Thank you.